You never quite know when you're going to need a hand out there on the water. Fortunately, here in the US, we've got the US Coast Guard standing by on the ready to help out whenever somebody's in need. Kind of like this situation here, where a 49-year-old sailor found himself in a little bit of trouble off the coast of San Diego. Fortunately, the Coast Guard was able to jump in, get him rescued off the boat, and get him brought back to safety, just like some of the things we'll see in this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to the Kerridge Strait, where this was the scene this past week. Now, what's a little odd about this scene is we're seeing vessels right here in the Kerridge Strait, which unfortunately at the time of the filming of this was actually closed. Local maritime authorities closed the Kerridge Strait through November 30th due to suspected rough weather coming into the area, making the strait extremely difficult to navigate. But as it turns out, many ships actually ignored that warning, which was there to avoid what's about to happen here as these two ships collide. The two ships can be seen rolling in the heavy wind and waves in the strait. The two vessels wind up colliding as we see in the images, but to top it all off, they're just trying to maintain position and no longer can do so. They actually wind up drifting into an anchorage zone, and both these ships wind up colliding with a third vessel as well. Fortunately, during this situation, no injuries were reported, and the extent of the damage to the vessels is unknown at this time. Now, with the video images coming out, local authorities were able to identify the ships that were breaking maritime law by entering the strait, but nobody's announced at this time whether any charges will be submitted against either one of the boats. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to Vietnam, where this was the scene this past week, when local authorities started receiving calls of a massive cargo tanker being washed up on the shores. When authorities arrived, they immediately tried to make contact with the ship, but unfortunately there was nobody to make contact with. Somehow this ghost vessel had wound up on their shores with no crew on board. The vessel was quickly identified by the local authorities as the 433-foot-long product tanker King Rich, which is registered in Sierra Leone, and can be seen in these images here a few months back being towed in some rough conditions. But that's not the only rough thing the vessel faced, as a few weeks back the crew actually wound up having to abandon ship off the coast of the Philippines. Shortly after leaving the vessel, they were picked up by another container ship. The crew wound up telling local authorities that the King Rich had broken a propeller shaft and was taking on water, causing the evacuation of the vessel. 2 days later, the Philippine Coast Guard went back out, found the vessel, and let the owners know that the vessel was still afloat and they needed to try and arrange a tow for the boat. But when they went back to try and tow the vessel, it could not be found. Until now, where it showed up 1,000 miles from its last known position on the Vietnamese coast. Local authorities say the vessel does show some hull damage from landing on the rocks, but other than that, it looks to be in pretty good shape. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to the Philippines, where this was the scene just a little over a week ago when the 287-foot cargo vessel Viet High Star was traversing off the coast carrying a cargo of 80,000 bags of rice, when all of a sudden one of the crew members noticed a leak on the starboard side of the vessel. The crew quickly contacted the Philippine Coast Guard, who arrived about 45 minutes later. The crew worked feverishly for several hours attempting to stop the ingress of water into the boat, but eventually were unsuccessful and determined the best course of action would be to abandon ship. The Philippine Coast Guard jumped into action, pulling all 17 crew members off the boat without injury and wound up taking them to Ballback Port. The next morning, the Philippine Coast Guard went back to the vessel to check on the situation, and this is what they found when they arrived. The vessel more than halfway submerged under the water. At this time, an investigation has been launched to try and determine the cause, but they're unsure of how the breach came in the hull at this time. They are working with the owner of the vessel to try and salvage. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to the coast of Japan, where this was the scene just a little over a week ago when a domestic car carrier wound up calling out to the Japanese Coast Guard, claiming the vessel was beginning to list. The captain brought the vessel closer into shore and wound up grounding it so the vessel wouldn't actually sink, but shortly after doing so, the list got more pronounced, so the captain ordered the 12 crew members to abandon ship. Fortunately, the Japanese Coast Guard arrived shortly after the call and was able to pull all 12 crew members successfully out of a life raft and bring them to safety. The next day, salvage crew members showed up to try and salvage the boat, but it was not in the same location they had left it. The high tide had actually lifted it off the bottom, and the vessel had drifted approximately 5 miles before salvage crews were able to find it and get attached to the vessel. Salvage crews brought the vessel back into port and actually wound up towing it into shallow water again to try and prevent the boat from sinking. Currently, the Coast Guard's investigating the situation, but at this time, they actually believe the vessel hit a rock, causing a hole in the hull. The Japanese Coast Guard says they believe at this time that they are investigating dangerous or negligent navigation by this crew. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening on your waterways, be sure to hit us up on Facebook or Instagram and let us know, and you might see your stories over here. And if you haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button.